In this lesson, we are going to continue to look at sectionalism, but we are going to mostly focus on the abolitionist sisters from South Carolina and also on the political consequence of the North having control of the House of Representatives and why the South did not want to have the Senate also fall into the hands of the North. So I'm going to review most of the things we've learned. Sectionalism would become prevalent in the late early 1800s as the North and South developed differently. And sectionalism was where the people of the North and South felt more loyal to their own region than they did to the country as a whole. We also learned that the biggest issue dividing the country back in the early 1800s was slavery. However, there were other differences between the North and the South. The political parties were different, whereas the South was 95% Democratic Republican and the North was Federalist. The economies were considerably different because the North was based on trading and manufacturing, while the South was based on large plantations and slavery was a necessity for those plantations. The events that would increase sectionalism between the North and South was pretty much anything that the North and South felt differently about. Slavery being the major division point, slave rebellions and decisions about slavery, as we'll learn later on, really would increase sectionalism. Two slave rebellions, but really only one occurred, were the Denmark-Vesey plot that happened in Charleston and the Nat Turner Rebellion. Both of these had several effects. One, they increased sectionalism. Two, whites were scared of slaves more. It increased the fear among whites. And three, the slave codes were strengthened more due to that increased fear. We talked about the Louisiana Purchase and the political consequence of the new states that would form from it. And we learned that the North had control of the House, and the Senate being balanced would become a major issue with the Louisiana Purchase, because new states in the Louisiana Purchase would affect representation in the Senate, and it would unbalance it either in favor of slave states or in the favor of free states, depending on if these states decided to allow slavery. Now, the South really feared that if the North, if these states were to decide not to allow slavery, that the North would have two more Senate votes on their side, and they would then have the House and the Senate, which could pass laws outlawing slavery. We've also learned about the abolitionists. Abolitionists were people that wanted to outlaw slavery throughout the U.S. It grew in the North, and it made South Carolina slave owners more determined to hold on to their peculiar institution. So the abolitionist movement would also increase sectionalism. We learned that the support for the abolitionist movement was not really that strong at the beginning. However, anti-slavery newspapers and literature would cause the abolitionist movement to become more popular among Northerners. These anti-slavery newspapers were, one of them was The Liberator, and this was published by a man named William Lloyd Garrison in Boston, Massachusetts. This caused an increase in those who were on the side of the abolitionists. However, these anti-slavery newspapers and materials, they did not make it to the Southern people because postmasters like this one threw the materials in the trash, calling it inflammatory nonsense. We learned that abolitionists were active in South Carolina, but after the Denmark-Vesey plot, abolitionists were either forced to be silent or leave the state. We also learned, and this is part of what the lesson is going to be today, about the abolitionist sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, from South Carolina, that later moved north and was a strong voice for the abolition of slavery. We reviewed the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad being a secret network of passages by which slaves could escape to the north. Of course, this lady, Harriet Tubman, was famous for being a conductor, as she was called, on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad would also cause sectionalism because the North is trying to help the slaves escape, while the South feels anything like this is it's basically like thievery, stealing their property. Here is a expanded map of the Underground Railroad, and as we know, the Underground Railroad was just a nickname for the secret paths by which slaves could escape. You can see here where the paths were. Some were even by ocean, by boats from, looks like, Charleston and Savannah here. But the main thing we learned is South Carolina was too far from the free state border to have the Underground Railroad be very effective at helping South Carolina slaves escape. Before I talk more about the Grimke sisters, we reviewed that slavery, the argument for slavery being a positive good, was that slaves were treated better than northern industrial workers. And part of this is because they had the slave owners had an economic investment in their slaves. We also learned that the abolitionist movement really only made South Carolinians more determined to hold on to their peculiar institution, which is another name that they called slavery, the peculiar institution. Continuing the review, here are the Grimke sisters, and there's a paper I'm going to use to educate you about them a little bit more. The Abolitionist Sisters from South Carolina. The Grimke sisters, they were wealthy when they were born. As you can see, they were born to this gentleman, and he was an officer in the Continental Army. He had 14 children. Sarah and Angelina Grimke were among them. Sarah turned against slavery when she was very young after she saw a slave being whipped and tried to board a steamer, that would be a boat, to a place where there was no slavery. And later, in violation of the law, she taught her personal slave to read. Now, they also would fight for women's rights, and it said she studied her brother's books, but they forbade her to study them or any foreign language. The sisters would become nationally known, traveling to the North and speaking out against slavery. They were also reformers of women's rights. And it said William Lloyd Garrison published a letter from Angelina Grimke in his journal, The Liberator, and they gained notoriety as being the first female abolitionists to speak out. And they were heavily criticized by both the North and South, for speaking publicly about their beliefs. But criticism in Charleston, their home, was particularly scathing, where they said that they had committed two unforgivable sins. They had befouled the parent nest, and they were attacking the peculiar institution, which of course was the Charleston name for slavery. Last, they said that after their mother's funeral, they tried to go to Charleston and attend her funeral, but there were riots that erupted when their arrival occurred, and the mayor refused to allow them to leave the ship, citing public safety issues. So these two sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, would be the abolitionists from South Carolina, and at great personal cost, because they pretty much estranged themselves from their own family by taking the course of abolishing slavery. I may have showed this in yesterday's lesson, but here's a show called The Abolitionist. I would like to find it, but it features most of the people we learned about. William Lloyd Garrison, Denmark Vesey, I believe, the Grimke sisters, and John Brown, a gentleman we'll learn about shortly. The limited notes today concern the political effect of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, we've already learned that the Louisiana Purchase would become pretty much the fueling ground for more sectionalism. And the reason is because of representation in Congress. Now, first, we've already mentioned that the North had control of the House, and the House is based on population. Now, why the North had control of the House was because of different settlement patterns that had occurred. The North had developed industry early on, and they had also developed an economy that did not rely on slave labor and left job vacancies. Well, this would attract further people to the North. Northern industry would attract European immigrants that were trying to flee Europe, come to America for a better life. The first thing that European immigrants need is a job. And where do they go? They go to where there are jobs. They land in the coastal cities on the ships from Europe, and they are welcome in these cities because there is jobs. Well, as a result, these immigrants moved to these cities. They weren't exactly welcomed by the population, but there are jobs, so I'm going to correct that. Now, as such, the population in the North rises. And when the population rises, this causes the North to have more votes in the House. Now, these immigrants didn't go south because there was no jobs there. Everyone in the South used slave labor. Before we go over this, here's a picture of Congress, the Capitol, made up of the House, which is based on population, and the Senate, which is equal, 2 per state. Now, the northern population rising would affect votes in the House, and it would swing the House in favor of the North. So the North would control the House, which, as we went over, that would mean in today's House they would have to have 218 plus votes. Well, they had that. They had a majority of the votes because of the immigrants that moved in. So the northern population rises. This results in more northern or free state representation. And as we know, this is one of three things easily or quickly needed to pass laws outlawing slavery. So the South is very nervous. Now, as has already been said, the Senate was balanced because there was an equal number of free and slave states. So, by the process by which a bill becomes a law, if it passed the House, it was probably not going to pass the Senate because there were not a majority of votes to carry it through. So the South is so worried about losing control of the Senate because then the North, the free states, would have control of both houses of Congress. And if they have control of both houses of Congress, all they would need is a president to sign an anti-slavery bill. And that is the South's worst nightmare, to lose their slaves. Now, here's a picture of the United States, the original states here. There was an equal number of free and slave, which caused the Senate to be balanced. However, the Louisiana Purchase is going to have new states come from it. And if there are, depending on what side they're on, free or slave, it is going to upset the balance that is maintained. And the South definitely doesn't want it to upset the balance and have more free states come from it. The final part of the lesson is about the Federalist Party and how the Federalists became the Whigs. Which, the Whigs, I know it's a funny name. Where did this name come from? Federalists make sense, but Whigs? Why Whigs? And that is what I'm going to answer right here. First of all, we know that the Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton. However, he was killed in the duel. And then various Federalist presidents, but also Low Country planter Charles Pinckney was a Federalist. And we also learned that after the War of 1812, and they opposed it, the Federalist Party went away because of the War of 1812 and their opposition to it. But the people that were Federalists would come back and rename themselves the Whigs. Now, the Whigs, well, it has nothing to do with a hairpiece, even though it's a cool name to remember. What it had to do with was an old group called the Whigamores. And the Whigamores were a group that opposed the English king in 1648 from Scotland. Now, why I pick this name is because America had a president who was acting like a king. And he was the Federalist opposition, a Democratic Republican. This Democratic Republican was Andrew Jackson. And they felt that he was acting like a king. In fact, he was nicknamed King Andrew. So the opposition political party picked the Whigs, symbolic group who opposed the king, as the name of the party that would oppose him. Here is Andrew Jackson's picture. He was a Democratic Republican. And here is some political cartoon which shows that they are portraying Andrew Jackson as a king. He, of course, wasn't a king, and the Constitution did most everything to eliminate anyone acting as a king, but Andrew Jackson was doing some actions that was somewhat king-like and overstretching his powers. This concludes the lesson for today. In the next lesson, we are going to learn about further ideas that would fuel sectionalism and ultimately lead to the Civil War. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.